Welcome to episode number 149 for the National Land Podcast. My name is Mac Christian, and I'm your host for this podcast, as well as the Chief Marketing Officer for National Land Realty. Now, today, we're talking about land, of course. And if you're a first-time listener or a long-time listener, you probably understand when it comes to land, there's a lot of crap out there. And if you start looking into it, you can really go down the drain. There's a ton of information. Don't get down in the dumps though, because today we're talking about septic systems. And yes, I'm still 10 years old in my mind. I can't pass up on the puns. I had a really hard time doing this conversation actually without dropping as many puns as I possibly could. But I held back, I refrained. Today we're talking with Tyler Skro and of Davis Horizons, and we're talking to Robert Waddell of National Land Realty. One's an agent, one is a septic specialist, and in this episode, you are going to get everything you've ever wanted to ask about septic systems. It's an enormously informative episode. It's a really cool thing. So huge thank you for Tyler Skro for doing this episode. He knows everything about septic systems, and he covers it here today. So sit back and enjoy. All right, there's a little beepy sound. So that means we are live, and there's no going back. So I'm sitting here with Tyler Skro of Davis Horizons. He's the president and CEO, and he has a big title. I'm going to let him say the title when I get to it. But he works with soil testing and septic systems. And I have Robert Waddell, who is an agent with National Land Realty, both out of South Carolina. I'm going to start with Robert since I ended with you, and then I'm going to jump into Tyler here because you got the longest title and the most background relative to the conversation here. So I want to use that to lead into the conversation. But Robert, tell me how you got into land sales. You're with National Land Realty. How did you get where you are right now?
So I've been with the company for, I think this would be the 14th year. Started out with Jason Walter and Jason Burbridge in Columbia at the time. And basically was my junior year of college, trying to find something to do, something I was interested in, loved being outdoors, loved helping people, just plug into the outdoors any way I could. So started bird dogging leads, what we call bird dogging leads for Jason Burbridge at the time, setting up meetings, making landowner calls, and just realized that, hey, this was something that I wanted to get into. I can make money being outdoors and just talking to people, talking to them about turkey hunting, deer hunting, whatever it may be. A place they could build their forever home, commercial property. It just kind of spiraled into that, and I've been down here in Charleston since I graduated college, and really haven't looked back.
So you're a very trusting individual, because I know the state of things back 14 years ago. Like, those guys started this company out of a garage. You're talking about Jason Walter, Jason Burbridge. These are the founders of our company. And you're talking about a couple scrubs operating out of the garage and starting a real estate brokerage. So you really put some faith in this.
We did. Yeah, we did. Well, I mean, we didn't have anywhere to go but up. So.
Yeah. And Tyler, tell me a little. Okay, so you got to give your title now, because I built this up. I've made it a thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, Mac, for the introduction. So I'm a licensed professional soil classifier here in South Carolina. I also hold a certification as a certified professional soil scientist with the Soil Science Society of America. All that to say, pretty much can just call me Dr. Dirt. That's the shorter version of it. I don't hold an actual doctorate, don't worry. But I got into this, business on a whim. I graduated from the University of Georgia. Didn't really know where I was going to end up. Started doing wetland consulting for a company here in South Carolina, and then ended up at the federal government for a few years and wanted to do something on my own. So that's the long version of the story. The short version is I just tell people I used to play with the dirt and eat dirt as a little kid, and this was really the only career path for me. So here I am.
For anybody listening, the only thing I could remember was Dirt Doctor, and I felt like that just didn't do it justice. So I had to say that part of it. And then you mentioned Davis Horizons is your company, and fairly large. Tell me a little bit about Davis Horizons.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to tell people we're a tech company that does soil work rather than the other way around. So it's myself and 15 other employees. I started it. I was a single person or single entity operator for first year and hired our first person. And we've grown to, again to 15 other people in a short amount of time. So it's basically me and a bunch of other millennials and Gen Z using a bunch of cool technology to test the soil.
I got to ask you, since we started out the conversation and I was joking about growing up in Idaho, and my child labor job was to work in my family feed mill that my great grandpa built with my grandpa. You're a new dad. Are you going to put yours to work in your place?
Yeah, that's the goal. That's the goal.
Right.
We got to buy a little sandbox for the backyard and get her set up on that. So hopefully, she's only a newborn, but hopefully here in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll get her out on some job sites.
Well, if you raise her right, she's going to be playing in plenty of dirt. So
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
All right, so we're going to jump into the conversation. We're going to talk to your specialty, and we're talking about septic systems. And this is, I feel like, people who live in urban areas have no idea what we're talking about. And so I want to first start the conversation off with is, what is the difference between a septic and a sewer?
Yeah, absolutely. So typical municipal sewer, that's something that's maintained by a public utility. There's going to be a central location where wastewater goes from all the homes that's processed and released back into the wild. However, at least in our state here in South Carolina, there's a lot of real estate growth. A lot of that real estate growth, both in our state and across the Southeast, is largely kind of on that rural urban interface. And so with that, in a lot of these areas, the growth is so rapid and municipalities can't keep up. So the only other way to process wastewater, in a responsible way at least, is to have a septic system. And so really all a septic system is some sort of system that's going to process that wastewater on site. And we're using nature and really the soil to facilitate that process. So it's really imperative that the work we do, we're making sure that the soil conditions that exist on a property can handle whatever wastewater we're putting into the ground. And we're not dumping, bacteria and other things that come with wastewater into the environment.
And describe, and for anybody listening, what kind, are there different kinds of septic systems? What kinds are there, and how do they sort of function?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a feeling this is going to be a recurring theme of what we're talking about here today. So generally speaking, the way we like to explain it when we're with new clients, because we're big on education, because this is very much an unknown topic, and there's a lot of things that are kind of floating out there that's just misinformation about it. So generally speaking,
I feel like that was a pun.
Yeah, exactly.
Floating out there. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, exactly. So generally speaking, we like to put septic systems under 2 umbrellas, at least here in our state, again, in South Carolina. So you have one umbrella, which we would call a non-engineered system. So this might be things that people call conventional septic systems, traditional septic systems, and a lot of different names for what these may be. But in our state, a non-engineered system is something that the state can issue a permit for without having an engineer involved in the process. And then in our second box or umbrella, we would have what we call engineered systems. Sometimes people call these treatment systems or advanced systems. But again, it's easiest to think of those as the 2 boxes, non-engineered and engineered. That's a good starting point.
Okay. And so an engineered system and an unengineered system, what's the structure of an engineered system versus, I'm picturing an unengineered system as a giant hole. So
yeah, a giant hole in the ground, right? Maybe back like 100 years ago. So yeah, regulations have come a long way. But an engineered system really, again, is anything an engineer is going to design. And so that could be something that is a conventional system that an engineer just draws up, at least in our state. Or it could be all the way to the Cadillac versions of septic systems out there, your pre-treatment systems, which are essentially functioning as almost little mini sewer treatment plants. for an easy conceptual way to think about it. So I wouldn't go about doing this, but I know a lot of those treatment companies and treatment plant products they sell say that you can drink the wastewater that comes out of them, but I'll let someone else try that out first.
Have y'all seen Waterworld?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what I got in mind.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
So now take me into unengineered systems. What do those sort of look like?
Yeah, so not the giant hole in the ground. It's a drain field, tile field, another name for it, where basically we're digging a trench or trenches in the ground, and based on what we find with the soil conditions, we're either putting in a rock and pipe, or there's alternative products out there to replace rock and pipe. That's often another misnomer or misconception is people hear alternative product. They think that means engineered system. So again, that's why I started with the 2 boxes. An alternative product, again, is just something that's replacing rock and pipe actually in the ground, which are fairly common. We see these systems or product types quite a bit, but it's really anything, again, that's going to be permitted by the state. But more or less the easy concept of what that looks like is you're digging a trench at some depth and putting in rock, pipe, or some sort of product to replace that. And then the soil in those cases is what's treating the wastewater actually in the ground to make sure we're not polluting groundwater in the environment.
Now, is there a certain like what are the parameters that gives you the difference? How do you know you need an engineer, or how do you know you need a conventional system on your property?
Yeah, so I like to joke that it depends on who you ask, because if you ask our clients, it just means that their neighbor has a conventional system and that means they get one too. But unfortunately, not how it works. So really, there's a lot of different factors we have to consider. And one of the 2 factors that really influences that is going to be, again, the soil conditions. So do we have proper physical characteristics of the soil that's going to work? And then the other component of that is the space requirements needed for a system. So back to the first set of those parameters with the physical aspects of the soil, the main things we're looking at are soil texture, which are going to influence how big the system is, combined with how much wastewater you're putting into it. And then the second factor is what we call the zone of saturation. Other folks might call it the seasonal high water table, all pointing to the same thing, which is where does the groundwater table sit at the highest point throughout the year? And those are the things we have to look at. Again, the second part of that is, do we have enough space? So sometimes the issue is we have good soil, not enough space. Other times we have plenty of space and not good soil, but these are all things that can influence, again, which direction the results may take us to an engineered or non-engineered solution.
So when you're saying space, what it sounds like is like you're talking a trench, and then your septic material has to get into that trench and hit the ground, and then it has to leach out, sort of like an underground alluvial fan kind of thing, where it just kind of fans out into the soil and disperses. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, so a trench is just going to be kind of a rectangular, if you take a track hoe bucket, dig a line, that's your trench. So both the sidewall of that trench and the base of the trench, those are going to be the absorption areas of the trench. And so that information essentially, as we look at the soil texture, all calculates to we need some amount of trench length or thus square footage for the system to work. And that's what we need to have based on those soil conditions, is that square footage or line length in order to permit some sort of system.
And so when you're talking about the soil, probably like clay versus aggregate, like water doesn't go into clay as easy as it does in the aggregate, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So, for example, here in South Carolina, we have a region just south of Columbia called the Sandhills, Carolina Sandhills. So we always love it, especially when there's like a neighborhood project in the Sandhills, because developers, their big question is, well, how many lots can we get on this? And in the upstate, Piedmont, where there's more clay, less lots because you need more space. And so when we're in the sand hills, more lots because we need less space, because those are faster soils. That wastewater can infiltrate into those soils quicker. So thus we need less square footage or line length overall to accommodate for a septic placement.
I want to jump over to Robert on this. Robert, because I mean you've been playing the land game for a while. So when you're looking at new developments, when you're working with acquisition of new land where somebody's going to build, how big of a factor is this entire thing? This looking at what's your septic area? How many septics can you have? Like, how important is this?
It's huge. It's one of the most important things after negotiations of price and things of that nature. That is top of the list when it comes to contingencies in a contract, is contingent upon having a septic system permit. So yeah, it's very, very important. When people are buying land, are they usually prepared for that conversation? This seems like one of those things where it's like, I got the land, I can build my house, and then you find out like, no, you can't. Yeah, it is. It's people prepared. The people hear the nightmare stories of, systems being engineered, systems that are, exuberant amounts of money, $30,000-$40,000 systems, and they're scared that could be their case when buying property. But we always recommend Tyler and Davis Horizons in those cases to do a lot of just pre-site prep work, have them out there during due diligence, go bore some holes, let us know what we got, put a LiDAR on the map on the property, let us know what kind of wetlands we're looking at. They do a good job of that, and kind of expedite that process of that question mark of what kind of septic system are we going to have here. Tyler, I mean, you can kind of answer some of those questions, I think, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So two, I guess, kind of follow-ups or things that come to mind. One thing we always see is, there's no such thing as free land. Someone's brother gifts them, hey, here's 20 acres. And there's a reason he probably wanted to gift them that 20 acres, because it's terrible for soil and septic. So this element of figuring out what type of septic system you're going to have is super critical to making sure your project stays within budget. We see this all the time. People close without completing a soil test, or again, they have a neighbor who has a conventional system from 60 years ago. Their cousin tells them, hey, soil's great out here, whatever the case may be. And then we get out there and have to burst their bubble and say, hey, get ready for about a $40,000 septic system. So that's a critical component. And then for any realtors, I would say, who are coming across this as well, when writing real estate contracts, it's super important to understand this terminology of what we're talking about between just something perk or not perk. We see that a lot in real estate contracts, and having this understanding between non-engineered and engineered septic systems. So might be a good thing we can kind of dive into. The common question we always hear is, does something perk? And at least here in our state, that means many different things.
So yeah, let's jump into that. Because I mean, perk test is something that people like to rattle off like they know what they're talking about. I hear that a lot, like, oh, we got to get that perk.
Yeah.
It's one of those, like, I don't know if that means what you think it means. Like that's, so tell us what a perk test is. And is that the same thing as when you're saying soil test? Is that the same thing?
Yeah. So from a definition standpoint, they're different things, but colloquially, or just, hey, I'm recommending this to someone, that they usually mean the same thing. So a true perk or percolation test is where you dig the hole in the ground, you pour, a gallon of water in it, and you see how much is drained out in 24 hours. That's the historical or common conception of what a perk test is and what people think we do. And there are some states that do that. I believe, at least in the Southeast, I think Tennessee still does that. But here in South Carolina, we do a soil test, or soil classification is what's actually in the regulations for it. And so again, that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We're actually looking at the physical characteristics of the soil. to give us a more accurate read of how the system will function, not only maybe during better climatic periods of the year, but during the worst climatic periods of the year, which is usually if there's some weather related event when systems may start to function less efficiently. So with that, we technically don't do perk tests here in South Carolina. Again, we do soil tests. And the reason that's important is because with a soil test, it's not a pass-fail. There are options in the regulation that allow, again, for a non-engineered system, which is what everyone wants, what most people are going to, again, refer to as a conventional septic system, or engineered septic systems, which still allow individuals a pathway to a permit, albeit a more expensive permitted system.
And when you're talking about this conventional versus engineered, is the engineered usually, you talked about the kind of super high end ones, but on a lower volume level, is that where we're talking like terms like septic tank or something like that the people are working with, or is that even a thing? Like these are terms that I want to kind of dive into. Like, tell me about these tanks.
Yeah, so this is good. I think maybe a good running title for this should be misconceptions about septic systems.
Yes.
Because that's another common one we see is we get phone calls and people say, hey, can you come out and do a perk test for my septic tank? And again, right away, it's like, well, perk tests, not exactly right. And then secondly, we're not actually testing for the septic tank. So if we go into the components of what a septic system is, again, right, you have the plumbing outflow from the house. That goes to your septic tank, which may be a plastic tank, concrete tank, whatever it is, but it's an enclosed tank that, if it works, isn't going to leak wastewater. From there, then it's going into the drain field or, again, tile field. And that's what we're testing for, because that's the contact point or interface between wastewater and the environment. And that's what we have to make sure is going to work and function properly. So when we do this work, we're testing for the drain field, not the septic tank itself.
I just have a curiosity. How's a septic tank work? What do they do? What's the purpose?
Yeah, so yep. So the tank, basically it's a holding tank in order to, and this is more for a conventional, just standard septic tank. It's basically a holding tank in order to allow equilibrium of water and solids. So the solid part of the waste that comes out of the house, as it sits there, is going to settle and move to the bottom of the tank. And then that way, all we're left with is the water itself that then moves into the drain field and disperses. So it's important that we're not getting solids into the drain field. That can clog it up. If it gets clogged up, then everything's going to back up into the house or above at the septic tank. So really, we just want that dirty water going into the drain field and having the tank then filter through the solids, which sit as sludge kind of at the bottom.
And tell me about the maintenance of this sludge.
Yes, absolutely. This is another good one because, again, I think everyone with a septic tank has a family story where their mima, or papa had a septic tank that didn't get pumped for 30 years. And if it didn't get pumped for 30 years, why do I got to do it with mine? And by and large, that may be correct. That's not to say if you don't maintain it, it will stop working, but there's a good chance it might. So going back to what I mentioned before with the solids and what we want in the drain field just being liquid, if you don't maintain the septic tank in a conventional environment every 3 to 5 years, typically, that accumulation of biosolids can increase, and it then decreases the volume of the septic tank to handle water. And then B, increases the chances or likelihood that you're going to get solids from the tank into the drain field, which is then going to cause your drain field to stop working at some point.
What's the expense on tank maintenance? Like you said, every 3 to 5 years. This is a good piece of knowledge for landowners to know. What's going to be the sort of the cost of this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny because I'm in a septic group here in the state, and I think someone 10 minutes before I hopped on the call posted about this. Generally speaking, you can expect about $500 for a tank pump. So if you're doing that every 3 to 5 years, it's minimal expense. And it's recommended to do. It's not recommended to put additives usually in the septic tank. You'll see things that get sold out there on the market to help treat the bacteria load and things like that. And honestly, as long as you're maintaining that septic tank more often than not, doing regular pumping, not driving over it with heavy equipment, whatever the case may be, the system should function as intended.
What would you say the average cost, and also the size? Like, are you seeing more? Would you say you're seeing like more 4-bedroom, 4-bedroom systems in South Carolina, and then the average cost of that conventional system? What would you say that would be?
Yeah, so there's definitely a break point where you'll see more cost increase once you go from 4 to 5 bedrooms. And the reason for that is the tank size jumps up. The minimum tank size requirement jumps up from 1,000 gallons for 4-bedroom and below to technically 1,250 gallons for the tank. Once you get to 5 bedrooms, they don't make a 1,250 gallon tank size for the most part. So you're typically buying 1,500 gallon tank. All that to say, a standard 3 to 4 bedroom conventional septic system, depending on your general locality and region in the state, probably reasonable to expect about $5,000 to $10,000 for material and labor for installation.
And you're most popularly or not installing. You don't install, but you're seeing pulling permits for 3 to 4 bedroom systems pretty much more than anything.
Yeah, I would say so. That's kind of typical of what we see.
Mm-hmm. And we just jumped into an area that I think most people who have dealt with land have dealt with is, oh, I perked for 3-bedroom. Oh, I perked for 4-bedroom. Like that's the terminology you normally hear. And
yep.
And being fair to your terminology, you're saying it's soil testing. And do you use the same kind of scale of, oh, it's soil tested for 4-bedroom or something like that? Is that sort of tell me this whole kind of classification system?
Yeah, absolutely. So the bedroom count's a big part of it, especially for residential. That's one of the components of how we figure out how big the system has to be. So with that, we have to know that because that when we test the soil, we have to finalize, at least in South Carolina, the exact footprint of the drain field. So how big it's going to be, again, that requires the bedroom count, also looking at the soil conditions. It's a lot easier from a permitting standpoint to reduce the bedroom count than increase it, because as we increase the bedroom count, again, we increase the size, and now we have drain field area that may be outside of our testing limits. So I always tell people, if you're between, say, 3 or 4 bedroom, always plan for more. It's easier to reduce. The state permitting agency, it's the Department of Environmental Services now. It used to be formerly DHEC. Used to allow for permit reductions for bedroom count without changing the permit. However, about 2 years ago, they've started to require that paper trail. So we do have to make permit modifications now for bedroom count changes, including reductions. But again, it's still easier to always do that with a reduction.
Question for both of you. How often do you see a house that tests for 3-bedroom that's miraculously has 3 bedrooms and 4 offices?
Robert, I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and I kind of defer. Is, hey, I want to build a home where we have 3-bedroom home, but we plan on having a gym and an office and a sauna, and I kind of defer to the builder on that, really, and stay in my lane when it comes to just the land, really.
I have that pictured as a workaround of like, it's not a 3-bedroom. It is a 3-bedroom with 4 offices.
Exactly. Yep. It happens.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. And that's a good point, because offices don't count towards the flow limit when we permit these things. So, usually not too much of an issue. Again, 3 bedrooms with an office, if we get to like 6 or 7 offices, like you said, we might make a different recommendation. Ultimately just comes down to what the flow rate is into the system. So and you're, a funny example here, maybe there's only one couple living there and they just want 7 offices. Maybe they got a workout room and an art room and whatever else. And so when we estimate these things, the regulation requires us to estimate 120 gallons per day per bedroom. So, if and when there was ever an issue with the system, one of the first things we would ask for is water data. And so it then less becomes about, again, house size and how many bedrooms you have, and really how much wastewater are you actually putting into the system. So we use those estimates to plan for that. That's what the regulation requires. And as long as we're not seeing crazy water usage that is contradictory to that, then we're usually in pretty good shape. We do see that now from time to time on a lot of the barrier islands, Folly Beach, Isle Palms, et cetera, where their municipal wastewater systems aren't allowing for new residences to tap in, so they have to go septic. And if you've been to these places before, these are multi-million-dollar houses right there on the beach, and that question about flow rate becomes a big component of things, because in these areas they're being used as vacation rentals, where they may not have continual usage that we would see in a normal residence, but they have really big spikes of usage that causes the system to blow out. So all that to say is it's obviously a component. These are things we have to be concerned with. And as much information as we get on the front end of what's actually going into the system, the less chance of there being an issue on the back end once it goes in the ground.
There's another pun. Sorry. I got to ask you about we were talking about Idaho here because that's where I am and you're in South Carolina. In Idaho, we're going on like a 16-year drought. And like the things that we get to worry about are like hard packed clay. We have a lot of clays kind of stuff, and that can impact the absorption of liquid. And so like we have our own set of problems with stuff. Like for the most part, I think Idaho ground begs for water because we're going on like a 16-year drought. But so I hear in South Carolina, y'all actually have water. And water tables end up being a thing, and wetlands mitigation is a huge thing out as you move east in the United States. And you can get water tables that are right up at ground level kind of stuff. I mean, granted, you usually can't build in a wetlands area, but you do run into wetland water tables. How do you deal with that? And is it possible, like, when we're talking mitigation, is it possible to still work around wetlands when you're working with septic systems? And I'm picturing these beachfront properties, this is a thing. So how is that dealt with?
Yeah, so there's really 2 things there to kind of touch on. There's septic in poor soil conditions and then the wetland component. So starting with the wetland component, the regulation prevents you from placing a septic system in wetland. So if you do have wetland areas, and again, these are things that have to be designated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's the federal agency that regulates that designation of waters of the United States. So if something is wetland, really the only way you can go about building and thus developing that is to get a wetland fill permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. So if you were to get that type of permit, filled the wetland, thus it becomes upland, then you could develop a septic system in it. So that's not as common, but it's important for people to know. It's a common question we get about wetlands and their development. So people need to know that. And then the second component of that is, we do have low-lying areas that may not be wetland, but they also don't have great soil conditions for septic. And that puts us typically in the engineered septic lane, to where really there's, at least here on the coast, this is kind of more of a coastal thing. On the coastal plain, it's really 2 solutions we typically see, and both involve building up to get above existing ground level with the septic component. And that's using a pre-treatment system. That's kind of, the Cadillac type of septic system. Might be a smaller footprint because you're using that, but you're still building up above the ground to put that system type in. And then there's what we call a mounded fill system, which really is the same thing to a conventional system. You're just building it up with soil conditions. So most of your septic construction cost in those cases is just the material in order to build that system. So it's a lot of dirt to do it. You have to bring in a lot of sand. So that's usually what drives up the cost of those design types.
I got a question about that mound and fill system. when it pertains to, real estate and things of that nature. So, you've got your conventional system, which is ideal.
Yep.
You've got your mound and fill system, which is engineered, costs a little bit more money. That kind of, there's a break point there for us in the real estate world where you're under contract. You have, somebody like Davis Horizons come out, perform a soil test, not a perk test, a soil test. And you find that the soil is not suitable for a conventional system. So the next route, or before you even get to the next route, very commonly we have a freak out period with the buyer or the buyer's agent, and they assume that the entire property is wetlands, it's not buildable, light it on fire, and we'll go find something else. So I guess my question is the mound and fill system superior to the conventional system? What are give me some, something to go off, or something I can tell, give us, talk to people about when we come across that problem of not getting a conventional system.
Yeah, so I would say, at least from what we see, the most common misconception with that is they hear engineered system and they think pre-treatment system. Again, and so I think it's helpful. I don't think we've really touched on this. A pre-treatment system, again, is kind of that mini sewer plant. So there's actual other components in or with the septic tank to treat the wastewater going into it. And that allows for a different type of dispersal field using pressurized drip tubing, which helps also reduce the footprint. So because of those other treatment components of those tanks and systems, yes, you're getting really clean wastewater and for challenging soil environments or space limitations, but those components to treat the wastewater, that's essentially what drives up the cost for those. Now, when we get into a mounded trench or fill system with what you're talking about, yes, it's still engineered. All we're doing is applying the same scientific concepts of how a traditional septic system works, which again is dig the trench, wastewater goes into it, the soil, physical and chemical properties are what treat the wastewater so it's clean when it hits the groundwater. That's the same thing that's happening with a mounded trench and fill system. We're just having to build it up, again, to create that vertical space to allow the soil to treat the water before it gets to a very shallow groundwater table.
Is a mounded system more affordable than a pretreatment system?
Typically, it depends on the manufacturer of the treatment systems. Again, there's a wide range of treatment systems out there. There's, the Ford Bronco version from like the 1980s, and there's, there's the Bugatti, that you're going to build your, 10,000 square foot beach house on. So it depends. But generally speaking, from what we see, the lower cost treatment systems usually become cost comparable to a mounded trench system. That will also, again, vary depending on your locality, the type of manufacturer, what your project scope is, but that's a general statement that typically applies.
Are these I'm picturing, a mound is a mound. Is this like the kind of mound like you don't want your kids to play on? Like, is this something like you want to fence up? Or is like
yeah, so
what's sort of like the impact of those in the area?
Yeah, so really they're more visual, aesthetic issue than anything. To get around that, what a lot of people will do is bring in fill material for their house pad and then basically blend the final elevations and grades so they're even. So you end up with a nice flat yard, but you may have built up not only your house pad, but now your septic field area, 2 to 3 feet. So if you don't do that, you'll just have a 2 or 3 foot, mound in your front or backyard. If you got enough acreage and you can put it in the woods somewhere, then, no one's going to know, and perfect, easy enough. But if it's right there against your house, a typical half acre to acre lot, might be in your best interest to bring in fill material to level it out. But again, that's additional cost to bring in fill for the house pad. And sometimes that's why people don't do both of those items to solve the aesthetic problem.
And okay, so I'm guessing lifespan is different on all of these, but what are we looking at in terms of lifespan of a septic system?
Yeah, so typical conventional trench style system, and again, this may even apply for engineered mound type systems, if maintained properly, um, 30 to 50 years is a typical average lifespan for those items. And I'm sure everyone's probably heard cases where there's a 100-year-old septic system that's still functioning. So as long as it's maintained and the drain field stays open with access to the septic tank through the distribution line, those items should function for as long as they're in the ground. You'll see efficiency drop, the older it gets, obviously. Now with treatment systems, because there's more mechanical components just involved, they'll still typically last 20 to 30 years. There's a little bit more yearly maintenance you have to do on those as opposed to kind of biannual or every 2 or 3 year maintenance kind of on a conventional septic system. So with treatment systems, you're typically trying to maintain those or have maintenance conducted usually 2 to 3 times a year. So we typically tell people with treatment systems, there's a little bit higher maintenance cost, but that maintenance cost is going to be comparable to a typical annual sewer bill if you had to compare the two.
Two-sided question. One is what are you looking at when you have to replace, and even so far as cost. And the second half of that is, how do you know when it's going bad?
Yeah. So as far as what you have to do, at least in South Carolina, replacements are typically considered repair operations. So with repairs in the state, they don't require new permitting as long as you are not exceeding the flow capacity of that system. So maybe I have a existing 3-bedroom house, my 3-bedroom system's failing, I want to replace it, just call up a septic installer and they can come out and do that. The only time new testing is required for that is if I had a 3-bedroom house, system's failing, and I'm going to put an addition on it, or add another house that's a 4-bedroom to tie into it, increasing the capacity. Now I've got to get a new permit, completely abandon or add on to that system at least. So that's what's at least required. Now, we'll typically see septic installers sometimes recommend doing soil testing when replacing systems, because again, if they were put in 30, 40, 50 years ago, regulations were very different. Doing a replacement now today may not yield the same functionality or end result replacing that system. And so while not required, it may be good due diligence to do that soil test, even though it's not required with a repair or replacement. And then as far as knowing when a system has to be replaced, again, annual or semi-annual kind of septic inspections with an installer should be able to provide that information. A lot of septic installers carry, scope cameras and things like that. You would typically see like, Roto-Rooter use if you had sewer. And so they can get into those, both the tank and distribution and drain lines, and see, hey, has part of the drain field collapsed? Are we seeing leakage anywhere? So that's usually good information for folks to make informed decisions. And then worst case is you got wastewater coming up out of the ground somewhere. That's usually a good dead giveaway that something's wrong. Time to move on to something new and better.
And then what's the, if you have to replace, and let's take like a conventional system, they got to replace, like, let's say the tank or something like that. What you mentioned initial costs are somewhere in the, I think you guys both said like 4 to 10 or something like that.
Yeah, 5 to 10. Yeah.
And so are you looking at like a similar cost for a replacement?
Yeah, again, that's going to depend on what a septic installer recommends. But if you're doing a full replacement, essentially the same thing as putting in a new septic system. So costs are going to be comparable to if you were just starting from scratch and having to put something in completely new.
And what are some of the things that can go awry with a septic system? I'm just curious.
I don't know if we have enough time.
There's plenty. I'm sure there's a lot. But let's take the low-hanging fruit. What are the biggest problems that you see?
Yeah, so feminine hygiene products, paper towels, non-septic approved tissue paper. Those are really the big three. Outside of like the random kid's toy or Lego that ends up there, which again, theoretically, these things will settle to the bottom of the septic tank. But again, the septic tank's purpose is to, over time, have the biological component of the tank, eat the physical biosolid that's in there. And so then we're left with the water that comes out. So if we're putting things into the septic tank and system that can't decompose properly, we're reducing that tank capacity. And we're also increasing the likelihood that the pipes, either from the house to the tank or tank to drain field or in the drain field itself, are going to get clogged and blocked. And so when we have blockages, especially in the drain field, depending on how it's installed and the distribution lines tie into each individual trench, we may be blocking a portion or all of the drain lines themselves, preventing them from functioning properly.
Gotcha. And as far as fixing that, I'm guessing it could be as simple as redigging the drain field to digging the whole dang thing up and reinstalling everything. Is that
yeah, they're never easy. They're never clean things that have to be done to fix septic systems that are malfunctioning. So depending on the age of the system and what clients want to do, and depending on the severity of the issue, maybe it's worth fixing. But a lot of times, especially as these systems get up there in age, more often than not, it's usually going to be best just to replace them and start fresh with a more modern or updated or more functional system.
That sounds like the reason that Nema's system is 100 years old.
Exactly. Yeah.
People don't want to deal with that. So in terms of state regulations and approval, okay, so number one, this is going to be different in every single state. So tell me a little bit about how in your area it affects approval, the state regulations, and sort of how they change over time. Like what sort of things have you seen that have changed from, say, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, so I can't speak directly from experience. Unfortunately not that old.
Yeah.
But the septic regulations, at least here in South Carolina, were first passed in the 70s. And that's not to say from that point until about 2010, they weren't useful or robust. They certainly were. But as development has increased and understanding of soil science and the effects of these soil components on septic functionality has also increased, we tend to see just more understanding of what should pass and what should not. So at least publicly, what we see is there's I think opinion out there that well, something passed 20 years ago, it should pass today. And so we again have to do a lot of education and conversation with folks about how that's not always the case. Show them the physical reasons why in the soil this isn't going to work. And that's not to say that putting in something that worked 40 years ago wouldn't work today. There's just reasons why it may not be the best practice and approach, and that's why we reach different conclusions today. So with that, really in South Carolina, we're fortunate enough that the only times we can have property that doesn't pass or allow for septic really is if where the septic system is going to go is wetland, or B, there's just not enough space due to setbacks. So sometimes you'll see this along beachfront or where there's a budding of property to the marsh with the critical line setback we have to apply. Those are really kind of the only instances I can think of that we've come across something where we have to tell folks, hey, your property is just completely non-buildable for septic. Now, again, that's not the case in other states. Other states have regulation differences that may prevent septic from going in just based on poor soil conditions. So we don't have that limitation as much here. The thought being behind it is we have engineered septic systems as an option, and really no matter how bad the soil is, usually 9 times out of 10, we can find some sort of solution to make it work. Now, whether that works for the wallet or not, that's a whole completely separate conversation people have to have with their realtor and probably their wife.
Well, I was going to say, and it doesn't really do you justice to talk about like systems in the 70s. Of course, you're not around in the 70s, but you're dealing with those decisions that were made in the 70s, and like that's something that you're always kind of adapting to. Are there any things that are sort of being discussed timeline wise that you expect to change as time goes on?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some things I think from our neighboring states that we would like to see here, and that I know there's been some initial pushes to try to incorporate some different alternative product types that give people more options for conventional type systems. South Carolina has both the benefit and maybe curse of kind of being in this unique position of there is so much growth, and I think that is encouraged, but with that, comes limitations on what there may be in the regulation. And it's funny because if you go to North Carolina or talk to soil scientists up there about their regulations, it's a completely different world. It's extremely complex, and that complexity has some merit. There's more advanced things they can do on certain sites, but it also really becomes extremely nuanced. It's really difficult to explain to the layperson, and also has more limitations on what municipalities or the state permitting agencies will allow, especially in poor soil conditions. So I like to think we're in a happy medium here. I don't think there's really any big changes on the horizon of what we've heard or seen for what's going to be permissible with septic, but definitely some things I think that the other states are doing. So we'd like to take their good parts and see what we can do to incorporate them here and leave the things we don't like, to our neighbors.
Are most of those changes, are they, I mean, I was going to ask if they're, some of those are going to be environmental, some of them are going to be, as technology and knowledge change. How much of it is related to population density, like you just mentioned, with South Carolina getting more and more popular?
Yeah, that's a big component. And I do think there are big misconceptions out there with septic. Not to get too much into the weeds with this, but there are a lot of environmental groups that are currently starting to pay attention to septic systems. And even municipalities. We have one municipality here kind of in the greater Charleston market that recently has prevented any engineered systems being permitted within their town limits. Which we don't agree with. I know a lot of the people trying to build there don't agree with, and it's unfortunate because their town limits also contain a lot of areas with poor soil conditions that otherwise need engineered systems. And so that's what I go back to with engineered systems. There's this misconception or misnomer that they're scary or dirty or whatever, and it's quite the opposite. The wastewater that comes out of them is actually a higher standard than you would see in an otherwise conventional system. And so this education component of understanding different system types, what this means not only for developers or home buyers, but municipalities that have to deal with these topics, and what do we do with all this development and growth? It's really important they understand the differences to these things, and enact good policy as well that's going to again keep systems from failing. No one wants that, us included, but also understand that there are things out there that can be, while scary sounding, better than otherwise, than what would otherwise be planned for certain things.
That is a problem I never even would have thought of, is like, just say no to poop tanks. Like that's just like,
just have a big picket line with,
no poop tank
like
line.
The poop
like
emoji with the line going through it. Yeah.
But to your point, if you have a higher density population area, then you need to be able to take care of it in a more efficient manner, and you can't do that with a conventional. It's municipalities have a resistance to change on a lot of levels, and so that's gonna matter. Robert, as far as working with this kind of stuff, what's the mistakes that you see people make? And I'm talking about like acquiring land, looking at it to build on, because you work on that side. Like that's your life. What are the problems you see them run into, and what do you recommend on when you're dealing with this? Like, I want to buy some land and I don't want to make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the major problems we see are just not being educated on the side of, the difference between a conventional and an engineered system. And again, going back to the mindset people have and the misconception that buyers and other agents have that engineered systems are bad, it's a huge misconception here right now. And I think if we had some more education, more ways to inform these people on their other options out there, not just this did not pass for a conventional system, so you don't. So we terminate a contract.
Yeah.
We don't need that. We can. It's hard to get them over that hump once they've made their mind up.
How
That's
often
the
do you see
biggest
people go
challenge
in
we
and buy?
have.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, how often do you see when people go in to buy land, they have no idea they should even have a septic test, like a soil test or a perk test, and like this whole thing catches them off guard. I'm just picturing that happens. Does that happen quite a bit?
Not often, but it happens. I mean, normally your first time buyers, your young couples that are not moving into that apartment complex or or the neighborhood, and they're jumping straight to a, let's say 2-acre or 5-acre piece of property with a barn dominium. They might not know anything about septic, or never even lived on a property with one. So yeah, it happens, and that's why you got to inform these people about that.
And Tyler, I'm going to go back to the conversation on like testing for like a 3-bedroom versus a 2-bedroom versus a 4-bedroom. Are there things that you can do? Like you go in, I've got a family of 5, and I soil tested. I'm going to use both phrases because it's different in every state. But I've tested for a 3-bedroom, and I've got 5 people in my family. Is there anything that people can do about that?
Not necessarily. I think, again, just having that information on the front end becomes super important. So the more information we have about a client or customer's project, proposed plans, how they're going to use their home or property, the more we can assist them through that process and help them understand what the requirements are going to be, what their expected costs may be. So that's always a big struggle as well. Why we try to do as much due diligence on a project as we can on the front end. But half the time we get, well, we're going to build a house out here. We don't know what we're going to use it for. Just find the best area. We don't have a site plan. And so oftentimes we get put into the position of kind of having to be not only the soil tester, but the land planner of a proposed project. So we wear many hats, and you do the best you can with those situations.
If they don't have capacity, are there situations where they can put in 2 septics to make up for the lack of drainage in the soil, or are there things like that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, where we run into a capacity or space limitation, that's where we would go into an engineered solution. So again, there's treatment systems, because there's treatment happening in the tank due to these other kind of technological improvements. We can use a reduced drain field size. The dispersal from the tank to the drain field also gets metered out. So with that, with a conventional system, maybe it's 200 feet or 2,000 square feet. And so instead of 2,000 square feet, now we're using a treatment system. Maybe it only needs 1,000 square feet. So typically with treatment, we can reduce that square footage by about 40 to 50%.
And is that okay? So, and that's something we probably didn't cover when we first talked about it, is when you test for a certain septic size, is that terminology, like, I've got a 3-bedroom septic or whatever, is that related to tank capacity, or is it related to drainage field size?
Yeah, so it's mainly related to drain field size. So again, we're testing for the drain field. So the soil characteristics that relate to this all relate back to then the usage, so the flow rate, and then what are the physical textural conditions of the soil, and that's what drives the drain field size or linear footage requirement.
Okay, I feel like that was an implied sort of like that's what it means, but I wanted to just be really clear.
Yeah.
Like, okay,
absolutely.
And if I'm hearing you right, by using an engineered solution with a pre-treatment, you reduce the drain field so you can actually increase the capacity. Is that, or?
Yeah, so you're not increasing the capacity or the flow into it, but you're reducing the size because of the treatment. The treatment increases, or excuse me, improves the quality of the wastewater. And because we're metering it out from tank to drain field, that reduces how much space we need. So think of it this way: with a conventional system, tank and drain field, we have the tank and then we have the drain field. So tank fills up with water. You flush the toilet once it's full. Now the wastewater goes into the drain field. So if I sit there and flush the toilet every hour, now I'm putting all this water into the tank that now goes into the drain field.
Yeah.
So depending on how that gets metered out, or how the timing of the water from tank then to drain field happens, you may have these surges that reduce the capacity, because again, we're relying on the soil to allow that wastewater to be treated and then move through as it gets down into the groundwater.
Okay.
So versus, when we have pre-treatment, these are pressurized systems. There's either a mechanical or chemical kind of component that's treating the wastewater so it comes out super clean. And because of that kind of pressurized component with the pump tank too, now I can flush the toilet, every hour in the same example, but some of that may be held back to where then it's pressurized and metered out into the dispersal field. And so I don't have these big fluxes into the drain field, because now it's controlled at the step behind it at the tank and the treatment tank. And so all of these are factors and reasons why we can reduce the drain field size when we're dealing with pretreatment. But these are critical elements to be, to why it's allowed for us to do that and have that as a solution. So it's great for those environments where, again, space is limited. People want a more environmentally friendly system going into the ground for them. You're just going to pay more for it. That's the trade-off.
Okay. And yeah, and I'm totally, I was catching in your answer. I'm like, I'm asking questions with the wrong terminology too, but your answer hit it on the nose, I think, with if you're testing at a certain septic size, like a certain bedroom size, that usually has to do with how large of a drain field you can install in that area. Because I mean, I can imagine if you have 100 acres, you can have a pretty large septic in that area based on, you can just make it really big drain field, right? Is what I'm imagining. But if you have a space limitation, that's going to limit how large your drain field is. And by condensing that, you can make it more efficient. Am I?
Yeah, more or less. The only kind of addition or thing to note there is with the 100 acres, we still have to have soil conditions that meet the minimum requirement. But as long as we're meeting those minimum standards, yes, space is not going to be the limiting factor on a 100-acre site.
It's typically topography, right?
Into that. Say that again, Robert.
On a larger site, it's typically topography, right? That limits your.
That's another component. So it's not as common of something we see here on the coast. So it's real funny if you go out into the woods with people who work here on the coastal plain, and you stand on a site. Do this, Robert. I'm sure you'll do this next time you have an out-of-towner who's looking to buy land here, and you say, well, see down there, the land drops, about half a foot. And someone from Idaho maybe would say, this is flat. What are you talking about? Yeah, that's not really a component of topography is not really something we have to worry about down here. Everything's flat, a couple inches of elevation change, generally speaking, across where you're going to be placing a system. Now, when we get into more sloping areas, when you get into the Piedmont kind of regions of the state, you'll have, big hill slopes, very obvious elevation change. And those are conditions where we can still put a system in. There's just different installation things that are required of it. And yes, we do have to be more mindful of topography. Things have to go on contour. We can't run system or drain lines just down a hill, because again, now all this wastewater is just rushing to the end of the line. So those are common misconceptions or things we often get asked or have to consider when we're dealing with more topography or sloping environments.
And as somebody's thinking through this, like, what we just talked about, drainage field size, like let's take the 100-acre scenario. Mm-hmm. You might be able to build like a 5,000 square foot field, but if the soil type isn't conducive to that, it's not going to matter. Like it's because there's that combination of size and soil type, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
And now the benefit, if you have 100 acres, is okay. Well, here's where you're planning to build. Here's where you're planning your septic. Let's go over to this other 5-acre area and test that. So the more acreage you have, just by nature, the more the probability increases that maybe we'll find something that works. Can't guarantee it, but probability certainly increases. Versus if you have a 1/2-acre lot, house is going to go in the middle. Septic's either going to go in the front or the back. So we don't need to dig 30 holes on your property to tell you, hey, this is going to go one way or the other. Certainly happy to do it if we get paid for it, but most people don't want to do that either. So those go a lot quicker. You're not going to see soil variability change, in a 1/2-acre area as much as you'll obviously see it change across 100 acres.
And I'll say something about that. We use Davis Horizons and Tyler a lot. We recommend them to clients for that reason, because they'll go, the other option is use DES, and that's the hard way. And you basically, as a owner or a buyer, have to physically go out and, chop these trees down, clear an area, flag out a lot, lay out your house, submit the paperwork. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears going that route. But we like to recommend Tyler because he expedites the process for us. They go out there with his team and they do the legwork, they do the permitting, and they have the maps and the knowledge to kind of forecast an area on that property and say, hey, this is a better area. You've got this beautiful oak tree here, but it doesn't appear to be the best area to build a house. Over here would be better. And that would, that in turn saves us as realtors a lot more time, and the buyer a lot more time when going about trying to find a septic site.
Yeah, and I do want to be conscious of time, Tyler. I know you have a hard stop here, and I want to get you out of here. So tell me about your company. Tell me about the areas you serve, and then we'll have your link in the show notes and everything like that. But tell everybody about your company and how they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mac, if I might just add one piggyback onto what Robert mentioned here, because
it's your time. You can take as much of it as you want.
Yeah. Okay. It was very triggering for me. He said it, and I was like, oh man, like we didn't even touch on this, and this is like so common. We get asked this question. So one of the common things we see, and Robert touched on it, was, hey, I've got 10 acres. Can you tell me where it perks or where it doesn't? And at least here in South Carolina, folks often don't understand when we do the testing, we have to finalize the actual drain field location. So we tie that down with measurements to property lines, GPS coordinates, all that. And what that basically says is, here's where that system is going. Here's what that system will pass for, perks, again, using everyone else's terminology. So we typically don't do this thing where people want us to come out and say, well, does it pass here? Does it not pass there? And the reason for that is because depending on what they're doing, it may pass here, or if they change their plans, now it doesn't pass here. Because again, that space component is part of the analysis we have to consider. So we can, again, as opposed to the state DES, we can go look in various areas. That's not something that they're going to do. So yes, we can more comprehensively assess a property. But oftentimes folks don't understand when we assess the property, we do have to finalize locations for the exact placement of that septic field. And that saves us from issues where, oh, now I've moved over here. Because the soil conditions may be different. And so we have to be really exact and final with that. So I just wanted to add that last plug because it's something that comes up so much. And I really just want folks to understand who are listening, who do have to go through this, that if and when you go buy property, You don't have to have exact site plans. It's not required, but we do have to at least get things at least concrete enough to where we can finalize where these septic systems are going to go in order to answer these more general questions of does something pass or not, because it's very specific.
That's a good bit of knowledge. Well, yeah, tell about Davis Horizons.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned at the start of this discussion, we've been in business for just over 4 years now. Got 15 other employees plus me, so we're up to 16 right now, continuing to grow. We cover all of South Carolina. We've been doing that here for the last couple of years now, so we cover every major metro area and in between. So Charleston, Greenville, Columbia, Florence, you name it, we'll go. We've got folks all across the state. Team of GIS people to help us make maps. So if folks want more information, they can find us here on the web. Our website is just www.davishorizons.com. Super easy to sign up for work. We have a contract form on our website. So everything's automated. Like I said, we're a tech company that does soil work. So we try to make it as easy for folks to both reach us here either on the web or in the office. Or get signed up for work, and always happy to help answer questions and help people out wherever their needs are.
And Tyler, when we like talked previous to set this up, you warned me that we would probably go over the hour and then some. And I'm assuming we didn't even touch on several topics that we should have. I just want to let you know I really, really appreciate your knowledge base. This is a terrific topic, and you clearly know the topic. This is super cool. Like, this is super valuable to anybody buying land, owning land, or anything like that. And Robert, thank you too for your years of experience with landowners and working with the acquisition of land and selling land and stuff. Super cool topic. I very much appreciate your time on this. I love it.
Thanks for having us, Mac.
Absolutely, Mac. No, I appreciate it. And glad we were able to get together and chat about the subject. And like you said, there's plenty more information out there to still learn about septic. So if you have interested folks who need more info, they're always more than welcome to reach out, and we're happy to point them in the right direction.
Awesome, man. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Have a good day, Mac. See you. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Mac. Thanks, Robert.
This concludes episode 149 for the National Land Podcast, talking about septic systems with Tyler Spro of Davis Horizons and Robert Waddell of National Land Realty. You can learn more about land ownership and the buying and selling of land at nationalland.com. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and rate it whenever possible. If you haven't rated this podcast yet, please rate it, subscribe to it, do everything you can to engage in this podcast, because you don't want to miss our next episodes. Thank you and enjoy.